Thank you.
Not in the least bit intimidating, goodness me. Thank you all very much for coming. And many thanks to Baillie Gifford. This is the Baillie Gifford International Writers Series. My name is Razia Iqbal. I work for the BBC. This conversation is being filmed for the BBC. It's being live streamed as I speak, and it's also going to be part of BBC World Television Talking Books programme. We are here to listen to Jung Chang. In her new book, the Chinese author takes as her subject the Dowager Empress Su Shi, the concubine who launched modern China. We also know Jung Chang as the writer of Wild Swans. That's her personal story, and the story of her mother and the story of her grandmother, and also a very, very popular and somewhat controversial biography of Chairman Mao. The Empress Dowager in the book written by Jung Chang is a book in which she dismisses the predominantly Western view of her as either tyrannical or vicious, or even hopelessly incompetent. She didn't obstruct reforms, according to Jung Chang. She was smart, she was patriotic, she was open-minded. And more than that, she was a proto-feminist who brought medieval China into the modern age. Jung, what was it specifically that drew you to her as a subject you wanted to research?
Well, I first got interested in Empress Dowager Cixi when I was researching Wild Swans. You know, in Wild Swans, I described that my grandmother had bound feet, crushed and bound feet. And I, then realized, what sort of a pain that was to my grandmother. This was her shoe, and she was my size. So the foot binding was not just to put a piece of cloth around the feet. Only the big toe was allowed to grow, and the other 4 toes and the arch were crushed under a big stone, and the binding was there to stop the broken bones from the recovery. So this form of torture, really tortured Chinese women for 1,000 years. And I, grew up in communist China, had thought that foot binding was banned by the communists. And in fact, London Mayor Ken Livingstone went Beijing and tried to justify Mao's atrocities and said, Mao banned foot binding, and that alone would justify him killing 70 million people. But when I met him, I asked him to do some homework. But the thing is, then when I was researching Wild Swans, I realized foot binding was actually banned by the Empress Dowager. And sorry, were we having my PowerPoint? Oh, no. Okay. Was banned by her. And that got me very interested because her image, her reputation was this archie-conservative who dragged China behind, who was responsible for all the horrible things that happened in China. She was cruel, she was a despot, and that was different from the image I got from the banning of bound feet. So that's how I first got interested.
And the binding of the feet is an image that will stay with anyone who's read Wild Swans as a kind of really potent image of what was so oppressive for women in particular. Tell us a little bit about her story, because in and of itself, it was an extraordinary entrance into the imperial court. Here was a daughter of a provincial official who became Emperor Xianfeng's concubine. And although there was a sort of fatalism to what her future might be, she actually made her own destiny, didn't she?
Yes. Well, she was born in 1835, and when she was 16 years old, she went through one of those periodic nationwide selections for imperial consorts. She caught the eye of the emperor and Beijing at the time, and she became an imperial concubine, and that was she, and that's her husband. And then in 1860, the British invaded China and burned down the old summer palace, as you probably know. And then the emperor, Cixi's husband, fled north with the court, and Cixi was with him. And the emperor was so heartbroken at the burning down of the summer palace, and he refused to return to the capital, and he died in the northern wilderness. And the emperor and Cixi had only one son. The emperor had only one son, and that son was by Cixi, and that son became the next emperor. Oh, of course, this is not their son. This is actually one of the ancestors of the Pekingese dog, because when the British Army went into the old summer palace, they found an elderly imperial concubine. They found the body of the elderly imperial concubine who didn't manage to flee with the court. And around her body were 5 Pekingese dogs, and the British brought them back. And this one they named Luti and presented to Queen Victoria. Queen Victoria actually had Luti painted in this picture.
Indeed, it was Lord Elgin's mission, wasn't it, to crush the emperor's pride and his feeling. And that informed Cixi's sense of how China should relate to the outside world. That was absolutely crucial, that moment, wasn't it?
Yes, I mean, the emperor was crushed himself. And when he died, he appointed 8 grandees to supervise his son, who was only 5 years old at the time. That was the son, the boy in blue. And Cixi then seized the moment and launched a coup and ousted these 8 grandees, because she thought that the 8 grandees would go down the same road of confrontation with the West. You know, at that time, in 1861, China's door had been closed for more than 100 years, and the emperors had all resisted Western effort, particularly British effort, to open the door, which led to the burning of the summer palace and the death of the emperor. So Cixi then thought, you know, why must we engage in this confrontation with the West? Why can't we open the door of China and do business with the West and benefit China itself? And that, common sense thought changed China. And she opened the door of China. She first launched the coup. She ousted these 8 regents. She killed 3 of them. 1 of them was beheaded. And the other 2 were each sent a long silk white scarf to hang themselves with. That actually was called the Cibo. It was supposed to be an imperial favor. But her coup was popular, and then she changed, because she changed the course of China, and she brought peace with the West. She brought peace internally, and China sort of embarked on the road of reforms.
The period that you're talking about, China was beset by revolt within the country, and also the possible incursion which it had just seen with the British in the Second Opium War from without. Tell us a little bit about the traditional Confucian culture, which meant that although she may have engineered this coup, it wasn't possible for her to rule openly.
Right. Well, she stopped foreign invasion. She established diplomatic relations with the West, and she defeated peasant rebels. She brought a degree of prosperity to the people. I mean, you know, well, we'll talk about that later, but I mean, this is how she ruled, and she was carried to a morning audience by the eunuchs. But she could not see her officials face to face because they were all men and she was a woman, and a woman was not supposed to rule. So she had to sit behind the screen, not on the throne. Her 5-year-old son would be seated on the throne, and she was behind the screen, and the officials would prostrate themselves in front of the throne. I mean, you know, you may have been to Beijing and see this magnificent Forbidden City. And Cixi, even though she became the supreme ruler of China for nearly half a century, on and off, but mainly on, she never set foot in that front part of the Forbidden City. She was confined to the back of the Forbidden City, the harem.
And although your book focuses on Cixi, the relationship between her, she was a concubine, let's remind everybody again, but the relationship between her and the Empress is a very interesting one, which you explore in the early parts of the book. Tell us a little bit about how that relationship worked, because she, although had not given the Emperor the son that he wanted, it was Cixi who had the son. The relationship between Empress Zhen and Cixi was a very interesting one.
Yes, the Empress Zhen is this lady. Yes, this lady. I mean, I was astonished when I was doing the research, because my idea of the harem was this place where women stab each other's back, you know, being nasty to each other to try to gain the emperor's favor. In fact, I found that it wasn't like that. I mean, this empress, the Empress Zhen, and the Cixi concubine actually became best friends, and they launched the coup together. And together they faced death by 1,000 cuts. You know, that was the punishment which was in practice in China today, and it was prescribed for treason. And what they did was treason. And after the coup, they ruled together from behind the screen, and they divided their work, and they collaborated remarkably well until 1882, 20 years later, when Empress Zhen died of a stroke. And of course, Cixi had always been accused of murdering her, but you know, documents, archives have definitively proved that she died of a massive brain hemorrhage. And they were actually best friends.
The subtitle of your book is the concubine who launched modern China. Specifically lay out for us what the reforms are that you attribute to her.
Right. Well, you see, whatever we have today, modern things which existed in 19th century was brought in by Cixi. Electricity, telegraph, the telephones, railways, modern mining, modern industry, a modern navy with, you know, ironclads, which had just been invented in Europe, a modern, sort of modern equipped army, and educational system. You know, Chinese educational system traditionally was, you know, to subject a 4-year-old boy to this regime of spending every waking hour memorizing these Confucian classics, which were, you know, dry and incomprehensible, certainly for a 4-year-old. And many people at the time described it as intellectual infanticide. And Cixi herself did not go through that regime because she was a woman and she was not given the full regime, but she was sort of described as semi-illiterate. That may have worked to her advantage because she kept a supple mind, an open mind, ready to absorb new ideas. And she then, when she had power, she then threw out that old educational system. And today, Chinese educational systems are based on Western educational systems brought in by her. And of course, as we mentioned, she banned foot binding, she launched women's liberation, she released women from their homes and encouraged them to have a public life. And she, of course, ousted death by 1,000 cuts. She banned it, and she brought in Western legal systems. Etc.
The passion with which you speak about her suggests a closeness, an attachment to your subject. Tell me a little bit about how that developed. As you were researching, did you feel that she was someone that you changed your view about and actually began to become fond of?
Well, the thing is, yes, I didn't really have a view about her, but I heard a lot about her when I grew up because she was big in China, and but she was always the villain, and she was always condemned for all the wrongs of China. So I, grew up with a earful of how wrong, how awful she was, and then I was first surprised, as I said, more than 20 years ago, by this foot binding thing I discovered. And then when I was researching the biography of Mao, I was astonished by the opportunities and the freedom the young Mao enjoyed growing up under her and in her legacy. Mao was born in 1893 and she died in 1908. The thing is, Mao was a peasant lad, but he could easily get scholarships to go to college, to go abroad. He could travel with his girlfriends and check into hotels, and he could write for an incredibly free press. By the way, Cixi also introduced the press into China, which was much freer than the press we have today in China. Now, that also astonished me because all these things Mao could do 100 years ago was something I couldn't dream of doing when I was growing up under Mao. So I feel there is a degree of astonishment when I was researching the Empress Dowager. And also then when if you Google her today, you probably will still see her as as being described as this arch-conservative, die-hard despot, so on. And all these untrue things attributed to her. I just feel it was very, very unjust. And I guess that influenced my writing. And I was trying to, I thought, let's be fair to this woman.
But also championing her in a way that certainly some historians have argued that the reforms that you attribute to Cixi were much more to do with the aftermath of the Boxer Rebellion and the Taiping Rebellion in 1864, which was a complete turning point for that dynasty, that there was an element of devolved power to the provincial governors, and that they had sufficient power, which actually meant that she may not have been the originator of all the reforms that you attribute to her.
Well, you see, and I don't think that's true. And yes, the provincial chiefs had tremendous power, but Cixi gave them the power. I mean, in the Qing dynasty, the emperor made the decision. There wasn't even the prime minister to help making the decision. There was certainly no cabinet. I mean, now when Cixi's son was 5 years old, when her son took over but died in a couple of years' time, and then Cixi then adopted a 3-year-old, her nephew, and put the 3-year-old on the throne, and she continued to rule from behind the screen. For all these years, I mean, she was exercising the emperor's power, and she had to issue edict. I mean, it's not at all true that the provincial big shot called the shot, because they all had to obey the imperial edicts, and no one can issue those imperial edicts except Cixi when her son and adopted son were children, were young.
So you don't accept at all that she was, in some ways, dependent on those provincial governors?
Well, like a good leader, she asks people to debate, and she takes good opinions. I mean, she made the decision. I think that's what it matters here as a leader. A leader is not somebody who cooks up ideas and make everybody follow them. I mean, you know, that would be a disastrous leader, a bad leader. And Mao, my previous subject, was such a leader. And he had this thing in his head. He was going to dominate the world. He was going to build China into a military superpower. So he imposed that on even his close colleagues. And he bought these sort of arms industries and nuclear technology and equipment and missiles, etc., from Russia. And he exported the food for these expensive purchases. And as a result, you know, some 40 million Chinese died of starvation. And Mao couldn't care less who said. I mean, he didn't take advice from his colleagues. But the Empress Dowager was a different ruler. She opened the debate, and she selected advice, but ultimately she made the decisions. I mean, that makes her the leader.
Do you think, though, that the warlordism that we associate with early 20th century China was a direct result of the power that the provincial governors had? And in fact, she had to look to them in some respects they needed their reforms endorsed in education and technology, but that there was a kind of symbiotic relationship rather than one where she was the person who originated the reforms that you attribute to her.
Well, the warlordism didn't happen under her.
No, it came after she had died.
When she died, precisely because she died. I mean, the provincial chiefs before had this fierce loyalty to Cixi, and then they suddenly lost this object of fierce loyalty, and that's how, and the next guy, Yuan Shikai, the first president of Republican China, because 3 years after Cixi died, China became a republic. And when that man died, China lapsed into warlords fighting, but not until late 1910s and the 1920s. Now, Cixi commanded fierce loyalty. I mean, just one thing, you said these provincial chiefs had tremendous power, but they were constantly moved. And she could sack anyone at any time. She moved them around, and they all had to obey. You know, if they had real power, they surely would not accept that. And I just wanted to, you know, Cixi's, that would, by the way, that was, you know, her envoy abroad. Here is in Britain with Lord Salisbury and Lord Curzon and Li Hongzhang, and the Chinese Gordon, of course, who fought for her, for Cixi, and defeated the Taiping Rebellion, Charles Gordon. Now, this man on the side was also employed by Cixi. He is an Ulsterman, Robert Hart, a British employee, and Cixi had the open mind to employ this British man to be in charge of China's customs for as long as she lived. And he left China in 1908 after Cixi died. And he made a tremendous contribution to Chinese economy, at one point contributing to as much as 1/3 of China's national revenue. Here he is, you know, with his orchestra, Western Orchestra of Chinese musicians. And this man standing in the middle, Anson Burlingame, was President Lincoln's first ambassador to China in the 1860s after Cixi opened the door. But when his term was over, Cixi employed him as China's first ambassador to the West. He traveled around the West for 2 years, seeing everybody, including Queen Victoria, who wrote in the diary that I received the Chinese ambassador today, but he's an American. But the deputies are Chinese. Here is now all these decisions were made by Cixi. And most of them were proposals by other people. But she made the decision and she issued the edict.
Let's talk a little bit about how it worked inside the imperial palace. We've heard a little bit about how she had to do all her business behind the screen. But the power play inside the imperial court is something that you talk about in the book, the backstabbing that goes on. There's a lot of, she was a part of that too. However reforming she was in her mindset, that there was a ruthlessness. She would not have triumphed in the way that she had done if she wasn't informed by a ruthlessness in her character.
Yes. Oh, yes. I mean, she wasn't a shrinking violet. I mean, she's got a steely iron wrist. I mean, she was capable of immense ruthlessness. I mean, as you said, the court had a lot of battles. I mean, actually, they're riveting. But, I mean, it all boils down to reform or not reform, to open up to the West and accept Western missionaries and the Western contacts, send people abroad and so on, or to close up China. I mean, Cixi really dragged China into modernity, and how she dealt with the conservatives was most interesting because she never killed anyone because they were conservatives or they didn't agree with her. Later, she killed a few people because they tried to kill her. But for the conservatives, she preferred to take them along and to reach a consensus and to reform China together, which meant Chinese reforms in those years were they were actually earth-shattering, but they don't seem to be drastic because no blood was shed. And she preferred to let people see the results and change their minds.
This book was many years in the making, not as long as the research involved in the Mao book. But I wonder if you can just say a little bit about the process of researching this particular book, because you had quite extraordinary access to sources that people had not had before. Just explain a little bit of what sources you used and how that came about.
Well, the wonderful thing about writing the Empress Dowager was the archives about her and her dynasty are open. In fact, they have been opened from the late 1970s after Mao had died. And the scholars, Chinese scholars, have been working on these archives. In the Forbidden City archives alone, there are over 10 million documents. I wouldn't dream of being able to access the 10 million documents, but the scholars and the archivists have been sorting them out, compiling them, publishing them, and even digitalizing some of them. Most of the imperial decrees are digitalized. So my research was often sitting in the comfort of my London study and bring up these imperial decrees on the screen. I mean, the contemporaries' diaries were published, the memoirs of the time, and not to mention the vast archive materials in the British archive, British National Archives at Kew, and the the Royal Archives at Windsor, where I had riveting times finding all these documents. I mean, that's very different from my previous biography, the biography of Mao, because Mao is still, you know, his portrait is on Tiananmen, his corpse is still in the center of Chinese capital, his face is on every Chinese banknote. The current leaders still claim to be Mao's heirs. And so Mao is still very covered up. My husband, Jung, and I really had to work like two detectives to get to the bottom of things, and it took us 12 years. By the way, I mean, Jung and I divided our work for the biography of Mao, not Cixi, yeah, for the biography of Mao by language. And because I'm Chinese, I dealt with the Chinese language sources. And Jung, unfortunately, speaks many languages, so he was landed with the rest of the world. We had some riveting time, you know, interviewing everybody from George Bush Sr. to Henry Kissinger to Imelda Marcos. There are some interesting stories if you later.
I'll ask you about the Mao book in just a moment.
Okay.
Let's just stay with Suu Kyi just for now. Very often in the book you say she must have thought this, she must have felt this. I wonder if you can say a little bit about that, because obviously you're writing from a contemporary perspective. You have your own perspective, your own psychology. Was there ever a tension in your mind of sort of imposing a modern sensibility on somebody who lived, you know, in the 19th century?
First of all, if I may say, I actually very rarely use "she must have." I know that's a fatal expression. You know,
occasionally you do.
Yes. Well, the thing is, most occasionally, you know, for example, I found her remarkably modern. Cixi. It's quite strange. I mean, there is a memoir written by an American painter who painted Cixi at the beginning of the 20th century. And she wrote that she found the Empress Dowager remarkably universal. I mean, the Empress Dowager had Western friends. And the Emperor, who by then was an adult, I won't see his picture, but was typically Oriental. And the emperor was, okay, we'll go back to him later. Now, Cixi was modern. Why I would try to get into Cixi's head, because I found it quite easy to get into her head. I mean, for example, also, sadly, I mean, there aren't these sort of psychological reflections in the archives. I mean, one example was Cixi's lover, probably her only lover, who was a eunuch. Because, you know, she lived in this forbidden city, the palaces, where no men other than the emperor and the hundreds of eunuchs were allowed. So she was surrounded by eunuchs, and inevitably, I think she fell in love with a good-looking young eunuch. But the consequence was tragic, because Cixi, you know, you could see her head was turned. That must be the time that I said it must be. There were evidences. I mean, there were courtiers saying her heart doesn't seem to be in her work. I mean, she was feeling languid, and, you know, all the signs of somebody in love. But to me, the biggest sign was she then broke rigid rules and sent the eunuch out of the forbidden city and out of even Beijing, which was absolute taboo in the Qing court. And this eunuch, Cixi sent him with an excuse of buying wedding robes for her son. And this eunuch was able to travel from Beijing, out of Beijing, you know, out of the prison of a forbidden city, out of Beijing, and go down to the south, on the Great Canal, and he was able to celebrate his birthday on the barge with musicians playing music. And all this was absolute taboo for the Qing court and for the times, and the grandees were up in arms. So they captured the eunuch and his entourage. They had him beheaded, and this was, we're talking about 1869, sort of earlier days of the reforms. But the grandees had the eunuch's corpse exposed for days, so the public could see he had, no male organs. And the entourage were either executed or sent to be slaves to the army guarding the border. And Cixi suffered a nervous breakdown. Of course, she left no diaries to say how she was feeling. But from the intensity of her breakdown, from the medical record of the court medical record of her intense medical, of her breakdown, and from all the details, I can say that, this can only be the result of losing her lover. And so that's the kind of time I feel I'm legitimate to make, to say things like that.
Your first two books are still banned in mainland China.
Yes.
And there are some plans, are there not, to translate this one into Chinese? Is that likely?
Well, the plan only involves myself. Well, the thing is I'm one of these sort of unfortunate people who, after finishing a big book like a Mao book, instead of, putting my feet up and relaxing, I launch straight into writing the same book, the Mao biography, but in Chinese. Then I go through the whole notes and the bibliography and so on in another language, which is why our Mao biography was published in 2005. And I didn't start writing about the Empress Dowager in 2008, because those 2 years were spent translating Mao into Chinese, getting it published and banned. And I've just finished translating the Empress Dowager. It's with my Chinese publisher, but not in mainland China, alas, in Taiwan. Well, I hope that Cixi is not what they call sensitive, and a book about her could get into mainland China and could even get published. But I don't hold out high hopes.
Give us a sense then of the pressures that you were under when you were researching the Mao book, because it was considerable.
Well, the thing is, when I was researching Mao, actually, there wasn't great pressure, because nobody guessed what our Mao biography was going to be like. I mean, there is a general received wisdom about Mao that he was good, he was 30% good, 30% bad and 70% good. He was all good until the Cultural Revolution and etc. and so on. But our biography of Mao was sort of more subversive. I mean, actually, to me as well as to the regime. So after the Mao book was published, there were attempts to ban me from going back to China. But I'm very pleased to say that the British Foreign Office helped, and also my readers of Wild Swans helped, because my mother, who's the main character of Wild Swans, still lives in China. She's in her 80s, she's frail, she can't travel. She depends on her children to go and see her. So I was given this permission to go to China for a couple of weeks a year to see my mother. And of course, I have to undertake, not to attend meetings, not to try to promote my books, not to talk to the press, the public, not even to attend big dinner parties. I just go and see my mother. And my books are banned. My name is, sensitive word. And people have, enthusiastic readers, shall we say, have scanned my books into the computer for other people to download. So a lot of people have read Mao and Wild Swans in Chinese. But of course, as you know, China has a vast army of censors, and they sit there diligently deleting these texts and closing down bloggers and comments.
It's a bigger challenge for them now than it ever was because of the pervasiveness of technology.
I guess so, in sort of in one way, but it also makes, in some ways, makes it rather easier. Just by
pull
control,
the plug.
They just pull the plug.
In some respects, you could argue that many of the, in terms of the big picture and China today, many of the issues that face the Qing dynasty in Su Xi's time, they could be compared to President Xi Jinping's challenges now. There may not be any foreign incursions, and China's economy, of course, has advanced considerably. The present-day government's survival, though, does depend on its ability to implement reforms. But the challenge, I suppose, is that you change too slowly and you risk the entire project floundering. And if you change too rapidly, you risk losing the central control and keeping a united China. I wonder whether you had that in your mind at least a little bit when you were thinking about Su Xi's story.
No, I never write my books with a current hook or thinking about the current relevance. I mean, when you write about history, you just have to go with the evidence. So I wrote Cixi purely about Cixi.
But the parallels are there.
Yes, it so happened, people are making these parallels about Cixi's last years to China today. In both cases, the doors of the country have been opened for decades. I mean, lots of reforms, of everything. Now, where do we go from here? Now, Cixi's answer was actually to go for a parliamentary monarchy. I just tell you one small thing, because this was so important. The legitimacy of the regime came into question for Cixi as well as for today's leaders. At Cixi's time, at first, she hung on to rigid court etiquette. She introduced everything, and she tried everything. She was a woman of intense curiosity and wanted to get into a hot air balloon and so on. But she never got into a car. And this was because in front of her, the court ruled that everybody had to kneel down. And with her permission, they could stand up. But in the car, the driver, the chauffeur, become an insurmountable problem because he couldn't drive kneeling down. He couldn't even drive standing up. And so Cixi, then she tried the tricycle, she tried everything, but she didn't try the car. But she also, of course, realized that the dynasty could not just survive on people kowtowing, kneeling, going down on their knees. It needs fundamental changes. And she wanted to introduce that legitimacy by building a British-style constitutional monarchy. And she launched this project in 1905 and made all sorts of preparations, and including making a 9-year plan from 1908. So in 9 years' time, China would have finished all these preparations, and there would be a vote. But that is not the road that today's regime is prepared to go down.
A very apposite moment to open the questions to the floor. Please raise your hands and wait, I think, for a microphone. There's a hand right here in the front, and then this one here. Thanks for your patience. Somebody's running with a microphone towards you right now. Thank you.
Hello. Thank you very much for interesting commentary on your book and Dowager. My question is, obviously with her first son, when he became of age, you'd expect him to have the power and not her. And you mentioned that he died fairly quickly and then she adopted somebody and whatever. Can you explain a bit more how she kept the power after normally the man would have taken over? Because that's quite interesting.
Yes, yes. I mean, you know, she ruled from behind the curtain, yeah, until her son was 16 years old. The son then formally took over power. But, you know, as a 16-year-old, he was not interested in reforms. He was not interested in running the empire. He was interested in having fun, and he was interested in having sex. He was particularly obsessed with sneaking out of the Forbidden City to frequent male as well as female prostitutes. And he died before his 19th birthday, having ruled for less than 2 years. I mean, there were rumors that Cixi murdered him and so on, which is not true, and as proved by the court medical records and the courtier's diaries. He really, he caught smallpox and died of smallpox. And now, but Cixi, on his deathbed, made her next move, and she made her next plan. And as soon as she died, she installed a 2-year-old and her, no, 3-year-old, her nephew, who she adopted as her son, and put this 3-year-old on the throne, and she continued to rule. But when that 3-year-old came of age, she again had to retire, which is also why China's reforms under her worked as start, stop, start, stop. Because when these boys took power, they stopped his reforms. I mean, her nephew was this young man who was not even interested in getting out of the Forbidden City. And he was full of phobia. For example, the thunders. So when there was a thunderstorm, eunuchs would gather to shout at the top of their voice to try to drown out the thunders. I mean, of course, then he suffered a tremendous defeat in the hands of Japan, and China began to go downhill.
The lady in the front.
Sorry.
What is your perception of how her legacy is received in China today?
Well, it's very complex. I mean, anyone who has access to the archives knows that she is the, would agree with me by and large. But they can't say it, because in China, the official version is she's this bad woman. I mean, so even though she was they are listing all her achievements, they all invariably attributed to the male officials around her. I mean, nobody asked the obvious question, but who issues the decrees? I mean, which was she. And of course, she was also regarded as this murderer who murdered this and that, the other. In fact, she did murder one particular person who was her adopted son, the nephew, the emperor. The day before she died, when she knew she was going to die, she had the emperor poisoned. This was definitively established in 2008, when the emperor's body had been exhumed and subjected to forensic examination, and it was found to have 2,400 times of arsenic. That's the normal sort of thing in people said. Okay, Cixi murdered him, no question. From her point of view, in my research, I realized, this was, from her point of view, if she had died and the son, the emperor, was alive, adopted son, China would have landed in the hands of Japan. Because the Japanese had been trying to do what they did in the Second World War to China, and she had put them off, and the emperor had wanted to go with Japan.
We've got time for a few more questions. The gentleman over there who's got the microphone, I think, in his hand now. There? Did you not pass the microphone over to somebody? Who's got a microphone?
I
You've
got
got
a
a microphone,
microphone.
stand up and use it.
Okay. Right, yeah, sorry, I did stand up, but then I sat back.
Sorry. I was looking over there. Go ahead.
That's right. You know, you said Sushi, she stopped the binding with the feet. Why did the women have that happen to their feet? And did she have it done? And then you also said she brought the westernized education system in, and that is still to this day. So the new emperor didn't change the education system from Sushi's
Back.
Yeah, he didn't change it back. And
Okay.
did she have her feet bound? Is that why she stopped the shows?
Yes.
Or she just didn't agree with? Why did they have their feet bound?
Right. Well, she luckily escaped foot binding because she was a Manchu. China's last imperial dynasty was a Manchu dynasty. And the Manchus were a minority. They were in Manchuria. They conquered China in the 17th century. And the Manchus didn't bind their women's feet. But the Han Chinese, who are 95% of the Chinese people, and they practiced the foot binding for 1,000 years. I mean, exactly why we don't know. I mean, but these ghastly things against the women in quite a few cultures. I mean, there is no justification, but only rumors. But she hated the foot binding and banned it. She was revolutionized the educational system, but the definitive move were only made in the earlier years of the 20th century, when she had already imprisoned her adopted son, the nephew, the emperor, because he had got involved in a plot to assassinate her. It's another thing in the book. I'm going to go into it. Yeah.
Gentleman there.
You've described very eloquently the way that the Empress opened the doors of China to foreign influences. Did her period of rule have much effect on Chinese literature and the place of women as writers and artists?
Yes, indeed. I mean, it was under her that China had its first female newspaper editor. We're talking about 1904, 1906. And China, Chinese women were going abroad. I mean, the great Chinese women, Madame Chiang Kai-shek, went to America and studied and became China's first lady. And Madame Chiang Kai-shek's sister, Madame Sun Yat-sen, actually had gone to America with a government scholarship. And she then became like the communist first lady. She became the honorary president of communist China. And so she opened the doors to all these women. Your second question is, what was the impact?
Yeah, what was there an impact in terms of Chinese women artists and writers?
Yes, I mean, I would say today, I mean, in Cixin's time, Western diplomats wrote that before Cixin's time, Western travelers wrote that when they were in China, if they were on their own or men, they were treated very nicely. But if they had a woman among them and they'd been thrown stones at, and Cixi got rid of all that. I mean, it was under her that women started to go out. In fact, I really couldn't help thinking that it fell on the woman to open China to the West, partly also because women benefited the most. And once she started to send people abroad, they wrote back diaries and reports and the letters, and they all say, you know, in the West, women could go out, walk arm in arm with their husbands. They can dance, they can sing, they can swim, they can skate. All these things she would love to do. But above all, they can be monarchs. Her first envoy, not apart from this American Anson Burlingame, the Chinese envoy to Britain wrote back and said, Britain is ruled by a woman, Queen Victoria, and everybody sings her praise. I mean, that could not, this is one of the times I said, this could not but produce a big impact on Cixi. There is no record saying Cixi saying this has a big impact, but I inferred because she could not, no matter how capable she was, she could only rule from behind the screen. And once the boys grew up, no matter how hopeless they were, and they had to take power and, you know, brought disasters to China along the way. No, so, I mean, all this, I mean, she I think inevitably she was drawn to Western ways.
I'm not sure there are any more questions. So one final question. Who's got the microphone?
Yeah. Hello, hi.
Hi.
Do you have any idea how Wild Swans was received in China?
How Wild Swans
Yeah.
is received?
Yeah.
Well, as I said, it's banned, yeah. But from the fact that people would, you know, take the trouble to scan it into the computer for other people to download, and from the fact that when Chinese tourists go to Hong Kong and Taiwan, Hong Kong, by the way, is still very much separate from mainland China, thank God, you know, so my books are available there, and from the fact that the tourists buy banned books, I mean, including my Wild Swans, and so on. And from the regime's reaction, they are so vigilantly deleting my books, banning my books, you know, making all these harsh rules, means that, you know, a lot of people like it. Thank you.
We have almost run out of time, but I'm sure, like me, you have been admiring what Jung Chang is wearing. It is an outfit that comes from the period of Cixi. Just tell us very quickly the story of this wonderful outfit.
Yes, I wear this thing because it's from her time. You know, she died in 1908, and at her time, Han women, particularly, you know, wore this kind of clothes. I mean, it comes from somebody, a lady whose family did silk, an Italian lady, family did silk business with China, and she gave me this robe because she loved Wild Swans. And so I think, you know, writing in solitary, you know, whatever, you know, have our rewards. and so I thought
as do your readers.
Yes.
Please join me to thank Jung Chang hugely for a fascinating talk.
Thank you.